Welcome to another episode of the F.O.R.C.E podcast. I am FIBA CEO and President David Schwartz.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of FIBA on Risk and Compliance Excellence, otherwise known as the F.O.R.C.E podcast. Today, we'll be discussing crypto crossroads, the Department of Justice's new direction. So our theme so far this year in 2025 has been, we're living in interesting times. And I think this issue is just one more example of that. So President Trump issued an executive order, number 14192, which was called Unleashing Prosperity Through Deregulation. And this was signed on January 31st and published in the Federal Register on February 6th. The federal regulatory agencies had been providing conflicting guidance on how financial institutions should manage cryptocurrency risk, ranging everywhere from yes, you can, to yes, you can, but talk to us first, to no, you cannot. And that guidance has been completely walked back. Lately, the U.S. Justice Department is disbanding its National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team and ordering its prosecutors to narrow crypto investigations to focus on drug cartels and terrorist groups. As a result, high-profile prosecutions against Coinbase, Ripple, and others have been dropped. Even the Treasury Secretary has weighed in, quote, "We will take a close look at regulatory impediments to blockchain, stablecoins, and new payment systems." So today, we're going to discuss this shift and the implications it has on both the financial services industry and the crypto industry with Rich Weber, partner at Winston Strawn, former chief of Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation, otherwise known as IRS-CI, and former general counsel at the New York Department of Financial Services, and also a good friend. Rich, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, David, for having me. I look forward to our conversation.
So you moderated a rather interesting panel on this topic at our recent annual AML compliance conference. But for those who missed it, maybe you could provide a little summary of how that discussion went, because you had a lot of crypto digital asset industry leaders, entrepreneurs that were involved in that conversation.
Yeah, so thanks for having me at the conference. It was a great time, a great audience of about 1,500 people, and a really good opportunity to talk about kind of the state of play at DOJ and with respect to the regulatory agencies in the crypto space, or as I like to say, in the digital asset space. And we had, I thought, a really good conversation with some former DFS regulators and some founders of crypto asset companies where we were talking kind of about the current environment and how the current environment has been changing and evolving with respect to, the regulators trying to kind of figure out what they're going to regulate or not regulate, and what law enforcement is going to focus on and what those priorities are, and how law enforcement and the regulators are going to try to figure out what is what when it comes to crypto. And it's a very, I think, exciting time, but also a very confusing time when you're in this space.
And as we know, banks don't like confusion. They love to work off of clarity. But to follow up on what you just mentioned, so what is the state of play? Where are we in terms of crypto regulation?
So that's a great question, and I wish I had a clear and decisive answer for you on that. And I think it's continuing to evolve, and I think it will continue to evolve in the next several months or so. And quite frankly, we are all waiting in the digital asset space for Congress to pass some legislation. And I think something will happen at some point soon, although I probably have been saying that for a while, that will try to put some more clarity as to the regulatory environment. What we do know is a few things. We do know that states like California and my old office, New York State Department of Financial Services, does have a pretty, I think, strict and pretty clear regulatory scheme and guidance and regulation as to what companies in this space need to do and are required to do if they're going to, operate in the crypto arena. But there is much confusion still, I think, in the federal space. What we also have now is we have a new Deputy Attorney General memo that came out just weeks ago that attempts to clarify at least what the federal law enforcement authorities will be doing in this space, and would love to kind of talk about what that means exactly, what it may not mean, and why I think it may still cause some confusion out there in the digital asset industry.
Well, let's follow right on
Sure.
it right now. So let's get into this recent memo, which you've mentioned, and which does have some interesting points that are articulated in it.
Yeah, David, I will say that I read the memo several times. We're in the process of writing an article at my firm, which will come out hopefully next week on a deeper dive into the memo, which I'm excited about. But the more I read the memo, the more I think confused I get as to exactly kind of what the impact will be. I think I understand what the intent is, but in terms of how this is being kind of viewed by others in the industry and law enforcement on the regulatory side, it's still a little bit, I think, nebulous and confusing. I think depending on where you sit, if you're a regulated entity, if you're someone in industry, if you're at a consulting firm, if you're at a law firm, if you're in law enforcement, I think you may take a little bit of a different view on some of these terms and how the Deputy Attorney General is talking about some of these areas. So, for example, one of the points that the Deputy AG makes at the very beginning of the memo talks about that the department will no longer pursue litigation or enforcement actions that have the effect of superimposing regulatory frameworks on digital assets. Now, I think I understand what that means. He doesn't want the department to be a regulator, and he wants the regulators to be regulators, and the department will look at criminal types of actions in this industry. What's interesting to me is one of the highlights. It's one sentence in this 4 or 5 page memo, but it's a sentence that talks about the department will still focus and investigate and prosecute individuals who cause financial harm to digital asset investors and consumers. And my view is when you look at that phrase, it doesn't say fraud in that sentence, but when you look at what types of cases would kind of embody this concept of causing financial harm to investors or consumers, I think there's a strong argument to make that that is fraud in the crypto space. So I think if you are involved in fraud like the FTX case, you're going to still be the subject of potential investigation and prosecution by the department. The memo also talks specifically about digital assets being used in furtherance of other criminal conduct, such as fentanyl trafficking, which is a significant priority of the department, terrorism, organized crime, human trafficking, smuggling, and quite frankly, all of those areas have been priorities of the department. All those areas were priorities of IRSCI when I was chief of the agency for 5.5 years. And a lot of these cases, whether it's crypto or whether it's fiat currency, are connected to other types of crimes. So I think between that sentence dealing with drug trafficking, terrorism, human trafficking, organized crime, cartels, and individuals who are causing harm to investors, I think that still is indicative that the department will go after those types of cases, and there's still, resources that are in the department that will focus on that.
No, and those are consistent themes of what and talking points of what we've been hearing
Yeah.
from the administration and the various regulatory agencies. We did hear FDIC Chair Hill mention that he wanted to rein in the agency a little bit so that they didn't, quote, color outside the lines, so
Right.
to speak, and that they were not conducting enforcement by or regulation by enforcement, that is not their role to carry out. So let's try. I'd actually like to delve in a little bit deeper, maybe tackle them one at a time. So as you mentioned, you were chief, head of a law enforcement agency. So this is a confusing time. So let's put yourself back in that chair. What would you tell your agents that their mission is at this point with respect to digital assets?
Right. So it's interesting. So when you look at IRS-CI in particular, the focus has been on all of the areas that we were just talking about. And you, of course, have to add tax evasion and tax crimes because we are the only agency. I say we as if I was still at the agency. I'm still proud of the agency and feel like that I'm still part of the agency in some way. I dedicated a lot of time there. But the agency has always focused on those types of significant financial crime cases. And I think they'll continue to do so. When you look at the last couple of years, and they've done a lot in the cybercrime and crypto enforcement area, and just in the last year or two, they have seized and forfeited over 7 billion, not million, $7 billion in crypto connected to financial crime, fraud types of cases. That money goes into the forfeiture fund. That money gets used by the Treasury. I think not just because it's a lot of money that they're seizing, but I think because they're making a significant impact in this area that those cases and that focus will continue. Do I think it means that there'll be some shifting of resources in terms of not doing certain tax cases or lower level financial crime cases? I do, but I do believe that my old agency as well as other agencies will still focus on these significant digital asset cyber types of crimes. I think there'll be kind of more of a focus on if there is a drug trafficking or a human smuggling type of operation, but those are cases that we have done previously. So I do think that there's going to be a little bit more attention to this area, and I think the agency heads are going to have to try to figure out how they kind of support the priorities, but at the same time kind of maintain confidence in this industry, which is an important balance. Now, David, you had mentioned about my old agency and some of I think the resource challenges. It's interesting because at the same time that I'm talking about some of the areas that I think the department will continue to investigate and prosecute, the DAG also in the same memo talked about disbanding the National Cryptocurrency Task Force, which was established, a few years ago to really focus prosecutorial resources in this area. And I do think that may send the message, and maybe this was the intended message, that that's not going to be a significant focus of the department. My view is, over the 20 plus years that I've been in government, you often have during different times, different administrations, different focuses, different priorities. and different like major task forces that are created in Washington to try to pool resources from like the U.S. Attorney offices and the other agencies. One can argue both ways whether those task forces are better or more effective, coming from DC or being prosecuted by individual U.S. attorney offices. I think that that the fact that they're not going to have a task force doesn't necessarily mean that you're not going to see investigations or prosecutions like we've had previously.
No, and it sounded like, and this was a question that some financial institutions have raised, is there a shift in our national priorities? Just remember, under AMLA, FinCEN published a list of national priorities without providing really any further guidance on what was the purpose, what was the point, how should they be looked at, how should they be used. And here in that statement that came out of DOJ when they were disbanding the cryptocurrency enforcement team, they were saying that, yes, just as you pointed out, we still want you to focus on this issue of drug cartels and terrorist financing, et cetera. And if crypto happens to enter in, then
Right.
We'll go down that road. But we're not going to take on where crypto prosecutions, where that is the primary focus. So I think that's an interesting shift. Now, does that?
I think that's right, David. I think that's right. But I also think that, every case is different, right? And although DAG memos matter and administration priorities matter, I also think it's going to be up to each, individual agency and U.S. attorney offices to kind of, figure out and interpret what those memos really mean and how to kind of, define their offices' priorities themselves. And every case, I think, is different in terms of, what is the real impact on consumers, on investors? How does it impact, the industry? So I think a lot's going to be, dependent on, the fraud or the conduct, the underlying conduct in each individual type of investigation and what's going on. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see over the next several months or a year or so as to how this develops. And I do think the cases that are going to come out, some have been, investigated for a while, some are being dropped, some are not going to go forward, others are going to start, anew. But I think that's going to really help determine what the department is really looking at and not just a standalone memo. Now, I will say that there are things in the memo that send a message, I think, to companies that this is not going to be, a major enforcement priority. Like when they talk about, not really, going after unlicensed money transmitters, under 1960 or violations of the Bank Secrecy Act, unregistered broker dealers, in the context of crypto, unless there's like a willfulness, willful intent on behalf of the, of the potential defendant target. And that's also something that's going to be the subject of interpretation in terms of, willfulness. You always want in a criminal context to be able to prove, a willfulness, although it may not always be required under certain statutes, but that's something that you want when you're looking at a criminal case. So it's going to be interesting how those cases are defined by the government. And then there are just other, I think, significant considerations that companies need to take, when they're looking at, this issue, this area, this memo. And I would love to kind of talk about, other actors, other players in this space, and why I believe as a partner at a law firm who advises companies all the time in the compliance area, why it's still incredibly important, to take all of these issues seriously as they kind of move forward in the digital asset space.
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue because that was my following
Sure.
question. We've talked about law enforcement and what this means to law enforcement and what direction they may take. But when it comes to the companies actually operating in this space, we've had these questions come up from financial institutions with other areas. The Corporate Transparency Act has been rolled back and other things. and the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and banks asking, well, what do we do now? And of course, our advice to banks is stay the course.
Right.
Always best practice is the most important thing. And you're always judged not by what you're doing today, but what you did in the past.
That's
So
right.
coming back to the companies that actually operate in this space, the digital service providers, et cetera, what do you advise them?
So I think that's a great question, and your points are exactly right, and I agree with you. And maybe this is the most important, part of the discussion, because there are a number of things I think that are out there. First of all, as you know, David, the law has not changed, so priorities may be, significant for this administration, but it may not, be the same priorities for the next administration. Congress has not abolished, these laws, and these investigations, most of them, in the financial, crime, money laundering, arena take years, to do. And I don't think there's going to be a kind of a complete shutdown of resources when it comes to any one of these, criminal enforcement areas. But enforcement, priorities change, and the laws are still on the books. Now that has to do with my first comment, change in administration, potentially at some point. But even under the current administration, priorities can change. And I'm not going to talk about politics or any of that. That's not my job, at the firm. But as we know, one day the priority could be, no enforcement, or we're not going to focus on enforcement on this activity. And the next day or the next week or the next month, there can be a change in terms of types of cases or types of crimes that the administration now wants to focus on. So it's very hard for a company to just stop complying with something because they believe that the priorities may not be as significant today, as they were yesterday, but that can change, dramatically, and not just with a new administration. You also have, the states, right? So, I worked for the Manhattan DA's office. It was a very, very, I think, proactive, fairly aggressive prosecutor's office in New York that would compete with the Southern District of New York and the Eastern District of New York on cases. Now, if the Southern District and Eastern District are not going to work certain cases, I'm pretty sure that the Manhattan DA's office will pick up those cases. And when I worked in that office, and I saw this even when I was a federal prosecutor, that office has a lot of significant experience and really great, prosecutors and investigators who like to focus on white collar financial crime cases, international cases. When I was there, we developed a financial intelligence unit and a S.A.R. review team, the only local office that had regular, daily, kind of reviews of the FinCEN database, where we looked for, S.A.R. activity, and we tried to build cases and support cases, from S.A.R.s. And this is from a local, district attorney's office. And I think that will continue. You have the state AG's offices. New York, I think, is a very aggressive office that will continue to look at cyber and crypto, and a lot of financial crime cases. They're all about protecting the consumer. California is the same way, and I think you're going to see this, among a lot of different AG offices. In fact, a lot of the AG offices are kind of coming together right now to work, as a team, almost like a task force in some of these cases. And then you have the regulators. I mentioned California and my old office, New York State DFS. DFS has been very active in this space. I think they'll continue to be. When you look at AML, BSA, cyber, those are always major, parts of their enforcement actions against these companies. Just a week or so ago, they announced an enforcement action against Block Inc., which is about $40 million involving, AML and BSA. And those cases, I think, will continue. So if you're operating in New York or another state, even if you think the federal government may not be prioritizing this type of conduct, the state regulators and the state AG offices will. And I think you need to continue to, do what is best for your company and to stay kind of within the bounds of the law. The other thing is when you look at, a bank, activities in terms of, AML responsibilities, it's very difficult. And I worked as head of financial crime compliance at both, at two international, I won't name the banks, but at two significant international foreign financial institutions. And it is, very challenging to ensure that you are, you have a adequate compliance structure. They have the governance and the training, and that you're, filing the right suspicious activity reports, and you're alerting on all this activity. And you don't necessarily know when you see a suspicious transaction as to exactly what it's linked to. You may see a wire transfer or an activity with a politically exposed person, or you may see, a country that we shouldn't be dealing with, or unexplained income or unexplained wealth, or you just don't understand the transaction, and you'll file a suspicious transaction report. Now, you don't know if that's a crypto case necessarily, or a fraud, or is there, money laundering connected to a drug trafficking organization? I mean, it may be a country where it's more countries more inclined to be involved in trafficking of fentanyl and narcotics, but you don't know as an institution exactly what that is. So to say that the government may not be prioritizing, crypto or prioritizing digital assets, but then as a financial institution or a company that has a responsibility to file SARs, you really don't know exactly what the link is, and you're going to be in potentially a lot of trouble if you don't, comply, and if you don't have the same kind of adequate framework in place in the AML/BSA area, because you don't really know kind of where the flows of funds are going. And I think that's important to keep in mind for institution. And then finally, if I could just say, just in terms of why I think it's important, because I do think compliance matters. I think culture of compliance matters. I think it's important for institutions and companies to do the right thing, regardless of what law enforcement or the regulators may be prosecuting, investigating, or enforcing. I think companies, that have a strong compliance program and that are doing the right thing with respect to, the cyber issues, and the preventing fraud, and preventing AML and BSA, and preventing bad actors from, entering their ecosystem, I think is the right thing to do, whether or not it's a, top priority, or a middle priority, or priority number, 15 or 17.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. And that's, as I said earlier, that's exactly the guidance that we're giving to our member financial institutions. Stay the course. Don't change what you're doing. Continue with your strong programs and your strong reviews, no matter how challenging it may now be, that you don't have the clarity that you had before. It was interesting. I was looking at the new guidance that came out from FinCEN yesterday regarding the oil smuggling out of Mexico, right, and the red flag indicators, and how they're asking financial institutions once again, keep an eye out for this. It's going to be a challenge, just like the executive order designating criminal organizations, cartels, as terrorist organizations. Right. How do you identify them? How do you know if person X is part of a gang, or you don't know he's part of a gang? And as I think we've seen with a couple of issues with deportations, just because you have a tattoo doesn't necessarily make you a gang member. Just because you might be in the oil business or tangentially in it doesn't mean that you're smuggling. Just because you're entertaining crypto transactions doesn't mean that there's some illicit or illegal transaction behind it. So it's still a challenge for the financial institutions, and they have to continue with those strong programs.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, David. And I know you're a huge proponent of public sector, private sector partnerships, and it's something that I've been I think focused on for many years in different roles and different jobs that I've had. And I think probably today in the current environment, it's even more important to have the public service, private sector cooperation exchanges, because I think it's important for the industry to know kind of what's happening behind the curtain at the agencies, what those agencies are working on, what cases. Now, obviously, law enforcement is not going to share ongoing case information or grand jury information, but there are a lot of there's a lot of information, and there are a lot of kind of red flags, as you mentioned, and other trends that the government is doing that they can share and then they should share. And the same thing with the banks and the companies within the digital asset space. I think they need to share with law enforcement and the regulators as to what they're seeing and how they could, better defend against this and to make sure that they are complying in the right way, because I think some of this is a little bit nebulous.
No, and yes, I am and have been for quite some time a very strong proponent of the public-private partnerships. As you know, at our conference, we've been hosting the public-private sector dialogue for Latin America with the U.S. Treasury Department since 2002 when it first started, and I believe it's the only surviving dialogue that's still in existence. And I used to come visit you when you were chief at IRSCI, and it's the only, we're in this together. And there's no way that we can fight these battles by ourselves in silos.
So actually, I would challenge you to even kind of do more now in that area, and I would love to participate in that because I do think that getting and it's hard to do, and I'm not sure that we've ever really been able to accomplish this, and not to blame anybody. I've been in different roles where I've tried and it's really hard, but to get everybody around the table, regulators and law enforcement and industry to talk about these things, because just like we're talking about the confusion about some of these memos and orders and priorities, I'm positive that the government investigators and prosecutors are equally confused as to some of these things. And I think that having an open dialogue to the extent that they're able to do so, I think would be tremendous to try to get everybody on the same page. Because at the end of the day, the industry wants to do the right thing. It's a business. They want to, they do want to make money and move forward. But they don't want consumers hurt. They don't want, to allow, bad money and terrorism money and trafficking money to enter their environment. So I do think it's in everyone's best interest to sit around, a table and talk about these issues.
No, absolutely. And we are trying to jumpstart this. Prior to COVID, we would meet quarterly with our local SAR review team down here. So there you have regulators, law enforcement, et cetera. And they would actually ask us, we're looking for a presentation from a bank on, say, the issue of the takeover of the gold industry out in the jungles of Peru. Can you come in and talk about that? And we'll share some of the typologies that we're seeing. And it worked very well. Unfortunately, since COVID, it's been a challenge trying to, even get the SAR review team back up and running the way it did previously. So we are definitely working on that, and we're looking forward to getting it going again, because I'm in total agreement with you. Our outreach to regulators, to law enforcement, has always been one of the primary missions at FIBA. And as I said, we used to come visit you and the other agencies in Washington when you were at IRSCI, and we continue to do that. So hopefully we can get the SAR review thing jump-started, because with all this confusion, you're right. We both want clarity. Both sides do.
I agree.
So I think our time has kind of run out here. Unfortunately, I was really enjoying this conversation. You and I have conversations like this outside of podcasts, but it's nice to allow an audience to actually hear your perspectives, and we appreciate you sharing them with us. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, David. Thank you for all that you do and for all that FIBA does in this space. So much appreciated, and great to see you again.
Thank you. So another great conversation, another great discussion on another very timely and relevant topic that industry is facing today. So keep in tune. There will be more to come on not just this crypto digital asset focus, but on other areas as well. So everybody stay safe out there, and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you for joining us in this new episode of The Force. Write to us at marketingfiba@fiba.net and send us the topics you would like us to cover in our next episode. For more information on the benefits and value of being a FIBA member, visit us at www.fiba.net.